Welcome to the Story Channel. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few notes. The content in this video uses AI-generated images and voice narration, combined with the channel's creative editing. Everything is intended solely for entertainment purposes and does not depict or reflect any real events or real people. Hope you enjoy the story and have a great time watching.
At the corporate dinner, my son-in-law spiked my food with a powerful laxative. I couldn't make it to the bathroom. He pointed his finger at me and said, "Look, the old man can't even hold it in anymore." The room erupted in cruel laughter. He didn't know I was the new owner of the company. So I grabbed the microphone on stage and announced my new first order as owner. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my 66 years of life would prepare me for the kind of humiliation I experienced that Thursday evening at the Meridian Hotel. The corporate dinner was supposed to be a celebration, a chance for families to mingle with colleagues and upper management. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, especially since it gave me a rare opportunity to see my daughter Avery in her professional element. The ballroom was elegant, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables draped in crisp white linens. I straightened my navy tie as I walked in, feeling proud to be there alongside Avery and her husband Ryan. At 34, my daughter had worked her way up to senior marketing coordinator at Hartwell Industries, and I couldn't have been more proud of her achievements. Ryan, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. My son-in-law had always carried himself with an air of superiority that made my skin crawl. Tonight was no exception. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that I suspected Avery had paid for, and his perfectly styled hair gleamed under the lights as he worked the room like he owned the place. "Dad, you remember Mr. Peterson from accounting, don't you?" Avery asked, guiding me toward a group of her colleagues near the bar. Her smile was bright, but I noticed the slight tension around her eyes that appeared whenever Ryan was nearby. I shook hands with Peterson, a pleasant man in his 50s who seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my background in manufacturing. We chatted about the changes in the industry over the past few decades, and I found myself relaxing for the first time all evening. That's when Ryan appeared at my elbow, carrying 2 plates from the buffet. "Harold, I got you some of the salmon. You mentioned earlier that you were hungry." His tone was friendly enough, but something about his expression made me uneasy. "That's very thoughtful of you," I replied, accepting the plate. The salmon looked delicious, perfectly grilled and garnished with asparagus and rice pilaf. Ryan had even remembered that I preferred my food without too much sauce. "I made sure to get you a good portion," he said, his hand briefly touching my shoulder. "You need to keep your strength up at your age." The comment stung, but I forced a smile. Ryan had a way of making everything sound like concern while actually being condescending. Avery had stepped away to speak with her supervisor, leaving me alone with my son-in-law. "You know, Harold," Ryan continued, lowering his voice slightly. "Avery was telling me how worried she's been about you living alone in that big house. Maybe it's time to think about something smaller, more manageable." I took a bite of the salmon, savoring the perfectly seasoned fish. "I'm doing just fine, Ryan. That house has been my home for 38 years. Of course, he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just thinking about what's best for everyone. Avery spends so much time worrying about you." The conversation was interrupted when the company president took the stage to make his annual remarks. I was grateful for the distraction and continued eating my dinner while listening to the speech about quarterly achievements and future goals. About 20 minutes later, I felt the first uncomfortable rumble in my stomach. I shifted slightly in my chair, assuming it was just normal digestion. But within another 10 minutes, the sensation had intensified into something more urgent. I excused myself quietly and made my way toward the restrooms at the back of the ballroom. The walking seemed to make everything worse, and by the time I reached the hallway, I knew I was in serious trouble. My stomach was cramping violently, and I felt beads of sweat forming on my forehead. The men's room was occupied, and I stood there desperately trying to maintain my composure. I checked my watch. It had been exactly 45 minutes since I'd started eating the salmon Ryan had brought me. The timing seemed too coincidental, but I pushed the thought away. Surely my own son-in-law wouldn't... I couldn't wait any longer. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and I made the mortifying decision to head back toward the ballroom, hoping to find another restroom or at least make it to my car. But I didn't make it more than 10 steps before my body betrayed me completely. The humiliation was instant and total. I stood frozen in the hallway just outside the ballroom entrance, feeling the warmth spread down my legs and knowing that my worst nightmare was becoming reality. The smell hit me immediately, and I prayed that somehow, miraculously, no one would notice. But Ryan noticed. Of course he did. "Oh my God, everybody look!" His voice carried across the ballroom like a foghorn. The old man couldn't even make it to the bathroom. The entire room seemed to pause. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, glasses froze halfway to lips, and every head turned in my direction. I felt like an animal caught in headlights, unable to move or think clearly. Ryan's laughter was the loudest sound in the room. Look at him. He can't even control himself anymore. He pointed directly at me, his face twisted with cruel amusement. This is what happens when you get old, folks. Better start buying diapers for dear old Harold. The laughter that followed wasn't universal, but it was loud enough and cruel enough to destroy what was left of my dignity. Some people looked away in embarrassment, others whispered behind their hands, but enough joined in Ryan's mockery to make me feel like the entire world was laughing at my expense. Avery's face went white as she rushed toward me. "Dad, oh my God, are you okay?" But even her concern felt tainted by the humiliation of the moment. I was her 66-year-old father, standing in a puddle of my own waste at her company's elegant dinner party, while her husband broadcasted my shame to everyone in the room. "I'm fine," I managed to say, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. "I just need to go home." Ryan was still chuckling as he walked over, making no effort to lower his voice. "Maybe next time we should make sure you use the bathroom before we leave the house, Harold. Just like a little kid." The drive home was a blur of shame and confusion. Avery had insisted on taking me, while Ryan stayed behind to handle the social damage, as he put it. She was quiet for most of the trip, and I could feel her embarrassment radiating from the driver's seat. "Dad, maybe you should see a doctor," she finally said as we pulled into my driveway. "This kind of thing, it's not normal." I wanted to tell her that I'd never had digestive problems before, that something about this felt deliberate and wrong. But how could I explain my suspicions without sounding paranoid? How could I tell my own daughter that I believed her husband had drugged me? Instead, I just nodded and thanked her for the ride. As I walked slowly toward my front door, still wearing my soiled clothes and carrying the weight of my humiliation, I felt something crystallize inside me. Ryan had crossed a line tonight. He had taken away my dignity in the most public and degrading way possible. But what Ryan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been carrying a secret for the past 6 months. A secret that would change everything between us. A secret that would give me the power to respond to his cruelty in ways he could never imagine. As I stood in my empty house, stripping off my ruined clothes and trying to process what had happened, I thought about the phone call I'd received just 3 days earlier. The call that had made me the owner of Hartwell Industries. Ryan had humiliated me tonight, but he had no idea that he had just done it to his new boss. The next morning I woke up with the events of the previous evening replaying in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape. Every detail was painfully clear. The sound of Ryan's laughter, the shocked faces of Avery's colleagues, the feeling of my own body betraying me in the most public way possible. But what hurt most was the memory of my daughter's embarrassed silence during the drive home. As I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, staring out at the garden my late wife Margaret had loved so much, I found myself thinking about how we had gotten to this point. When had Ryan's casual disrespect turned into outright cruelty? When had my relationship with Avery become so strained that she couldn't see what her husband was doing to our family? The answer, I realized, was gradual. Like a slow poison working through your system, Ryan's influence had been subtle at first. When Avery had brought him home 5 years ago, I had tried to be welcoming. He was handsome, charming when he wanted to be, and he made my daughter laugh. At 29, Avery deserved happiness after a string of disappointing relationships. But from the very beginning, Ryan had a way of making me feel like an inconvenience in my own daughter's life. It started with small comments that could have been innocent if you didn't look too closely. "Avery, your dad seems tired. Maybe we should cut our visit short." Or, "Harold, are you sure you should be driving at night? People your age have so many accidents." The comments were always delivered with a concerned smile. making it impossible to object without seeming unreasonable. Margaret had been gone for 3 years by then, and I was still learning how to navigate the world without her. I second-guessed myself constantly, wondering if maybe Ryan was right, maybe I was becoming a burden. The first major incident happened about 6 months after they got married. Avery had invited me to their housewarming party, a small gathering of their friends and some of Ryan's work colleagues. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, excited to see their new apartment and meet the people who were important in their lives. I arrived on time with a nice bottle of wine and a flowering plant for their balcony. Ryan answered the door with a look of confusion that I would later recognize as one of his favorite performances. "Harold, what are you doing here?" "Avery invited me to the party," I replied, suddenly feeling uncertain. "She called me last Tuesday and said 7 o'clock. Ryan's expression shifted to one of exaggerated sympathy. "Oh no, there must have been some miscommunication. This is actually a work event. You know how it is with younger crowds, probably not your scene anyway." I stood there holding my gifts, feeling foolish and unwanted. But Avery specifically said, "Dad." Avery appeared behind Ryan, her face flushed with what looked like embarrassment. "I thought you said you couldn't make it tonight." The confusion in her voice told me everything I needed to know. She genuinely believed she had told me not to come, but I remembered our phone conversation clearly. She had been enthusiastic about me meeting her friends, had even asked me to bring that wine she knew I kept for special occasions. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I must have misunderstood." Ryan put his arm around Avery's shoulders, pulling her close. "No worries, Harold. These things happen. Memory gets fuzzy at your age, right?" I drove home that night feeling confused and hurt. Had I really misremembered the conversation? Was my mind starting to slip the way Ryan kept suggesting? For weeks I doubted myself, going over that phone call again and again until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. It was only months later that I began to recognize the pattern. Ryan had a gift for making me question my own memory and judgment. He would have private conversations with Avery, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state, my physical capabilities, my ability to live independently. And Avery, wanting to trust her husband and genuinely concerned about her widowed father, began to see problems that weren't there. The suggestions became more frequent and more pointed. Maybe I should consider selling my house and moving somewhere smaller. Maybe I needed help managing my finances. Maybe it was time to think about assisted living. Each suggestion was presented as coming from a place of love and concern, but I could see the satisfaction in Ryan's eyes when Avery would nod along, agreeing that yes, perhaps it was time to discuss these options. The breaking point for me came last Christmas. I had been planning our traditional family dinner for weeks, the same meal Margaret and I had prepared together for 30 years. It was one of the few times of year when the house felt alive again, filled with the sounds and smells that reminded me of better days. Avery had confirmed she would be there, but when Christmas morning arrived, she called to cancel. "I'm so sorry, Dad. Ryan's coming down with something, and we don't want to risk getting you sick. You know how dangerous the flu can be for someone your age." I accepted her explanation, even though something about it felt wrong. I spent that Christmas alone, staring at a table set for 3 people who would never come. The turkey I had bought was too big for one person. The presents I had carefully wrapped sat unopened under the tree. 2 days later, I ran into Mrs. Patterson from down the street at the grocery store. She mentioned seeing Avery and Ryan at the downtown Christmas festival, both looking perfectly healthy and enjoying the holiday activities with what appeared to be Ryan's family. That was when I knew for certain that my son-in-law was deliberately trying to isolate me from my daughter. He wasn't just making careless comments or showing poor judgment. He was actively working to push me out of their lives. The realization should have made me angry, but instead it filled me with a deep sadness that seemed to settle into my bones. I was 65 years old, widowed and slowly losing the only family I had left to a man who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. I began to notice how Ryan controlled the narrative in every situation. When they did visit, he would steer conversations away from topics I knew about, making me feel irrelevant and out of touch. He would interrupt when I tried to share stories about Avery's childhood, dismissing them as old man rambling, or suggesting that my memory of events was probably inaccurate. Most painful of all was watching how Avery began to change toward me. She became impatient with my questions about her life, frustrated when I called more than once a week, distant when I tried to maintain the close relationship we had always shared. She wasn't doing it intentionally. I could see that she still loved me. But Ryan's constant suggestions that I was becoming needy and difficult were taking their toll. The phone calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. When we did spend time together, Avery seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone or looking to Ryan for guidance on how to respond to my comments. I found myself becoming more isolated, spending days without speaking to another person. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love felt like a mausoleum, preserving the memory of better times while offering no hope for the future. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. If Ryan wanted to paint me as a helpless old man who was becoming a burden, I would show him just how wrong he was. I would show both of them that Harold Morrison still had fight left in him. The process had taken 6 months of careful planning, strategic phone calls, and financial maneuvering that Ryan would never have believed me capable of. But yesterday, just 3 days before that humiliating dinner, I had signed the final papers that made me the majority owner of Hartwell Industries. Ryan had no idea that the pathetic old man he had humiliated last night now controlled his career, his income, and his future. But he was about to find out. As I finished my coffee and prepared to face another day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. For too long I had been reactive, constantly on the defensive, trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was worthless. Now it was time to take control of the narrative. Ryan wanted to play games with my dignity. Fine. But this time I held all the cards. The decision to buy Hartwell Industries hadn't come to me in a moment of inspiration or revenge fantasy. It was born from months of careful observation, quiet research, and a growing understanding that sometimes the only way to protect yourself from a bully is to become more powerful than they are. It started about 8 months ago during one of Ryan's particularly cruel performances at a family barbecue. He had been holding court with some of his work friends, telling stories about the old-timers at Hartwell Industries who didn't understand modern business practices. "There's this one guy in my department," he had said, not caring that I was within earshot, "who still uses a calculator for everything. Can you believe it? I keep telling my wife we need to start preparing for when these dinosaurs finally retire or get pushed out." Avery had laughed along with his friends, and something inside me had snapped. Not with anger, but with clarity. Ryan saw me as a relic, a leftover from a bygone era who had nothing valuable to contribute to the modern world. He had no idea that those old-timers he mocked had built the foundation he was standing on. That night I went home and did something I hadn't done since Margaret's death 3 years earlier. I opened my financial records and took a comprehensive look at my assets. What I found surprised even me. 43 years of careful saving and investing had left me with more than I had realized. The house Margaret and I had bought for $18,000 in 1985 was now worth $450,000. My retirement accounts, which I had been contributing to since I was 25, had grown to over $600,000. The life insurance payout from Margaret's policy, which I had never touched, sat in a money market account earning modest interest. But the real revelation came when I started going through Margaret's jewelry box and found the appraisal documents she had kept for her grandmother's diamond collection. Pieces I had assumed were family heirlooms with sentimental value were worth nearly $200,000. In total, I was looking at assets worth close to $1.3 million. For a man living alone in a paid-off house with minimal expenses, it was more than enough to fund a comfortable retirement. It was also, I realized, potentially enough to make a very different kind of investment. I spent the next several weeks researching Hartwell Industries from every angle I could think of. The company was privately held, which meant ownership information wasn't readily available, but public records and industry publications told an interesting story. Hartwell had been struggling for the past 2 years, losing market share to newer, more agile competitors. The founding family was getting older, and there were rumors that they were looking for an exit strategy. Through my connections from my manufacturing days, I was able to get in touch with Richard Hartwell himself. At 78, he was tired of dealing with the day-to-day challenges of running a business in an increasingly competitive market. His children had no interest in taking over, and he was facing the prospect of either selling to a corporate buyer who would likely gut the company or watching it slowly decline under his management. Our first meeting was at a quiet restaurant downtown, far from the corporate offices where Ryan worked every day, completely unaware that his father-in-law was negotiating to become his boss. "Harold," Richard had said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of a man who had built something from nothing. "Tom Patterson tells me you're interested in discussing the future of Hartwell Industries." Tom Patterson was an old friend from my days at Morrison Manufacturing, the small company I had built from the ground up before selling it to a larger corporation 15 years earlier. Tom had vouched for my business acumen and my character, opening doors that might otherwise have remained closed. "I am," I replied simply. "I think Hartwell has tremendous potential, but it needs fresh thinking combined with experienced leadership." Richard smiled. "Fresh thinking. That's what everyone tells me these days. But you know what I've learned after 50 years in business? Fresh thinking without wisdom is just expensive mistakes waiting to happen." Over the course of that lunch, we discovered we had very similar philosophies about business. We both believed in treating employees fairly, maintaining quality standards even when it was more expensive, and building long-term relationships rather than chasing short-term profits. We both understood that a company was more than just a financial investment. It was a community of people whose livelihoods depended on smart decisions and ethical leadership. "The problem," Richard explained, "is that all the offers I've received so far come from people who see Hartwell as either a competitor to be eliminated or a collection of assets to be stripped and sold. Nobody seems interested in preserving what we've built here." That's when I knew I had found my opportunity. "What if I told you I was interested in preserving and growing what you've built, not destroying it?" Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "I'd ask you to tell me more." The negotiation process took 4 months. Richard wasn't just looking for the highest bidder. He wanted to find someone who would honor the legacy he had spent 5 decades building. We had countless conversations about my vision for the company's future, my plans for the existing workforce, and my commitment to maintaining the values that had made Hartwell successful in the first place. The financial structure we eventually agreed upon was complex but fair. I would purchase 51% of the company for $850,000, giving me controlling interest and the authority to make operational decisions. Richard would retain 49% and stay on as chairman emeritus, providing guidance and institutional knowledge while transitioning into retirement. To fund the purchase, I liquidated nearly everything. I sold Margaret's jewelry collection, cashed out my retirement accounts despite the tax penalties, and took out a mortgage on the house I had owned free and clear. The financial advisor I consulted thought I was making a terrible mistake. "Mr. Morrison," he had said, looking at my plans with obvious concern, "you're risking your entire financial security on a business investment at 66 years old. If this doesn't work out, you will have nothing left." But he didn't understand what I understood. This wasn't just a business investment. It was an investment in my own dignity and future. Ryan had spent years trying to convince everyone, including me, that I was a burden, a relic, someone whose opinions and capabilities were no longer relevant. Buying Hartwell Industries would prove once and for all that he was wrong. The closing took place on a Friday afternoon in the offices of Richard's attorney. As I signed the final papers that transferred majority ownership of a $120 million company to me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. Richard shook my hand as we left the attorney's office. "Congratulations, Harold. You're now the owner of Hartwell Industries. What's your first move going to be?" I thought about Ryan, probably sitting in his cubicle at that very moment, completely unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. I thought about Avery, who still saw me as her aging father who needed protection and guidance. I thought about all the times I had been dismissed, ignored, or condescended to by people who assumed my age meant I had nothing valuable to offer. "I'm going to take some time to observe," I told Richard. "I want to understand exactly how the company operates, who the key players are, and where the opportunities for improvement lie." What I didn't tell him was that my observation would be particularly focused on one employee, Ryan Bradley, my son-in-law, who had just publicly humiliated me at a corporate dinner without realizing he was attacking his new boss. The irony was almost too perfect. For months, Ryan had been telling anyone who would listen that the older generation needed to step aside and let younger, more capable people take control. He had no idea that the old man he had been mocking was about to demonstrate exactly what experience and wisdom could accomplish. As I drove home that Friday evening, officially the owner of Hartwell Industries, I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. Ryan had spent so much time trying to prove that I was weak, confused, and irrelevant. Now I had the power to show him exactly how wrong he was. The best part was that he had no idea what was coming. While he was busy planning his next humiliation, I was planning something much more significant. A complete reversal of power that would change everything between us forever. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. The Monday morning after the corporate dinner, I woke up with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Margaret's death, I had somewhere important to be, something meaningful to accomplish. As I shaved and put on my best suit, I caught myself smiling in the mirror. Today I would begin my new role as the owner of Hartwell Industries, and Ryan had no idea that his world was about to be turned upside down. Richard had arranged for me to have an office on the executive floor, complete with access to all company records and personnel files. Officially, I was being introduced as a new senior advisor, which would allow me to observe operations without immediately revealing my ownership status. Richard and I had agreed that a gradual transition would be less disruptive to the workforce. Take your time getting to know the organization, he had advised during our final preparatory meeting. You will learn more in your first few weeks of observation than you would in months of reports and presentations. The executive assistant, an efficient woman named Patricia, who had been with the company for 15 years, showed me to my office and provided me with access cards and computer login credentials. Mr. Morrison, she said as she handed me a thick orientation folder, Mr. Hartwell asked me to let you know that you have complete access to all departmental reports, employee records, and operational data. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. My office had a perfect view of the main work floor, where dozens of employees went about their daily tasks, completely unaware that the company had just changed hands. From my window, I could see Ryan's cubicle in the marketing department. He was leaning back in his chair, feet up on his desk, talking animatedly on the phone in what appeared to be a personal conversation. I spent the first hour reviewing the company's organizational chart and employee database. Ryan was listed as a marketing associate level 2, a mid-level position that required a bachelor's degree and 3 to 5 years of relevant experience. His salary was $58,000 per year, with performance bonuses that could add up to an additional 10%. His employment file made for interesting reading. Ryan had been hired 18 months ago, shortly after marrying Avery. His resume showed a pattern of short-term positions at various companies, never staying anywhere longer than 2 years. His interview notes mentioned his enthusiasm and fresh perspective, but also noted concerns about his job stability and tendency toward overconfidence. The performance reviews told an even more revealing story. His supervisor, Janet Crawford, had documented several issues with Ryan's work quality and professional attitude. He frequently missed deadlines, spent excessive time on personal phone calls during work hours, and had difficulty collaborating with colleagues who didn't share his opinions. The most recent review, completed just 2 months ago, included comments that made my blood boil. Ryan continues to demonstrate a dismissive attitude toward senior colleagues and established company procedures. He has made several inappropriate comments about older employees being out of touch and has expressed frustration with what he calls outdated company policies. While his technical skills are adequate, his interpersonal skills require significant improvement. As I read through these documented examples of Ryan's arrogance and disrespect, I realized that his behavior toward me wasn't unique. He treated everyone he considered beneath him with the same condescending attitude he had been showing me for years. Around 10:30, I decided to take a walk through the office to observe the company culture firsthand. I introduced myself to various employees as the new senior advisor, explaining that I was conducting an operational assessment to identify opportunities for improvement. The conversations were enlightening. When I mentioned that I was particularly interested in understanding team dynamics and communication patterns, Several employees volunteered information about problem areas without me having to ask directly. "Well," said one of the senior marketing coordinators, a woman named Susan who had been with the company for 8 years. "Most of us work really well together, but there are a few people who seem to think they know better than everyone else." When I asked for specific examples, Susan glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "There's this one guy, Ryan, who acts like he's management material, but he spends half his day on personal calls and the other half complaining about how things are done around here." Another employee, a man in his 40s named David from the accounting department, was even more direct. "Ryan Bradley is a problem waiting to happen. He's constantly making jokes about the old folks who work here, like experience is something to be ashamed of instead of valued." By lunchtime, I had heard similar comments from 6 different employees across 3 departments. Ryan wasn't just disrespectful to me. He was creating a toxic environment for anyone he deemed inferior, which apparently included most of his colleagues. After lunch, I positioned myself in the break room with a cup of coffee and my laptop, creating the perfect opportunity to observe Ryan's interactions with his co-workers. I didn't have to wait long. Ryan entered the break room around 1:15 with 2 other marketing associates. He immediately dominated the conversation with a loud commentary about the weekend football games, peppered with crude jokes and inappropriate comments about the cheerleaders. "You know what this place needs," he said, gesturing around the break room with obvious disdain. "A complete overhaul. Half the people here are just marking time until retirement, and the other half are too scared to suggest any real changes." One of his companions, a young woman who looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, tried to change the subject. "I thought the new senior advisor seemed nice. Mr. Morrison?" Ryan snorted. Another old guy brought in to justify keeping things exactly the way they've always been. "I guarantee you he'll spend 6 months writing reports that nobody reads and then retire with a nice consulting fee." I took a slow sip of my coffee, fighting the urge to introduce myself right then and there. Instead, I continued listening as Ryan launched into a detailed critique of everything he felt was wrong with the company. "The problem with places like this," he continued, clearly enjoying his role as the voice of progressive thinking, "is that they're run by people who think experience matters more than innovation. They'd rather do things the slow, expensive way because that's how they've always done it." His companion looked even more uncomfortable. "I don't know, Ryan. Some of the senior people here have really good insights." "Please," Ryan scoffed. "Like who? Give me one example of someone over 50 in this building who has had a genuinely innovative idea in the past 5 years. I could have answered that question immediately. Richard Hartwell had implemented 3 major process improvements in the past 2 years that had saved the company over $200,000 annually. Janet Crawford had developed a customer retention program that had increased repeat business by 30%. Even Tom Patterson in maintenance had designed an energy efficiency system that had reduced overhead costs by 8%. But Ryan wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in promoting his narrative that younger employees were inherently more valuable than experienced ones. As the afternoon progressed, I continued my observation from various vantage points around the office. I watched Ryan take multiple personal phone calls, including one that lasted nearly 45 minutes and appeared to be related to planning a weekend trip with friends. I saw him dismiss suggestions from senior colleagues during a team meeting, roll his eyes when Janet Crawford was explaining a new procedure, and make sarcastic comments under his breath when he thought no one was listening. The picture that emerged was of an employee who felt entitled to respect he hadn't earned, privileges he hadn't been granted, and authority he definitely didn't possess. He was exactly the kind of person who made experienced workers feel undervalued and created resentment between different age groups in the workplace. By the end of my first day as owner of Hartwell Industries, I had a comprehensive understanding of Ryan's character, work habits, and impact on company culture. More importantly, I had documented evidence of performance issues that went far beyond my personal grievances against him. As I packed up my briefcase and prepared to leave, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. Ryan had spent months trying to convince everyone that I was a confused old man who didn't understand the modern world. Tomorrow I would begin demonstrating exactly how wrong he was. The best part was that he still had no idea what was coming. While he was busy planning his next display of arrogance, I was planning something much more comprehensive. A complete education in the difference between age and wisdom, between confidence and competence, between talking about change and actually implementing it. Ryan had humiliated me in front of an entire room of people, thinking he was safe from any consequences because of his age and position. He was about to learn that assumptions can be very dangerous things, especially when you're making them about someone who now controls your future. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for observation and planning. And soon, very soon, it would be time to act. After 2 weeks of careful observation and documentation, I had everything I needed. Ryan's personnel file now contained detailed notes about his poor performance, inappropriate workplace behavior, and negative impact on company morale. More importantly, I had witnessed firsthand how he treated colleagues, supervisors, and anyone he perceived as beneath his notice. The time had come to reveal myself. I had planned the moment carefully. Friday afternoon, 3:30, when most of the office would be winding down for the weekend, but still present to witness what was about to unfold. I had asked Patricia to schedule a mandatory all-hands meeting in the main conference room, officially announced as an introduction to new company leadership. As employees filed into the conference room, I watched from my office window. Ryan was among the last to arrive, clearly irritated at having his Friday afternoon interrupted. He slumped into a chair near the back, arms crossed, making no effort to hide his annoyance. Richard Hartwell opened the meeting with a brief speech about the company's transition and future direction. As many of you know, I've been considering retirement for some time. Today I'm pleased to announce that process is now underway. I want to introduce you to Harold Morrison, who has recently become the majority owner of Hartwell Industries. The room erupted in polite applause, but I could see confusion on many faces. They had known me as a senior advisor for the past 2 weeks, but this was clearly unexpected news. I stood up slowly, adjusting my tie as I walked to the front of the room. Ryan's expression had shifted from boredom to bewilderment. He was staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. "Thank you, Richard," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I'm sure many of you are surprised by this announcement. I've spent the past 2 weeks getting to know this organization, and I'm impressed by the dedication and professionalism of the vast majority of our employees." I let my gaze sweep across the room, making eye contact with several people before continuing. However, I've also identified some areas where we need to make improvements. Specifically, we need to address attitudes and behaviors that are undermining our company culture and creating a hostile work environment for our more experienced employees. Ryan was now sitting up straight, his face pale. I could see him connecting the dots, realizing that his new boss was the same man he had humiliated at the corporate dinner 3 weeks ago. Age discrimination is a serious issue in today's workplace, I continued. It's illegal, it's morally wrong, and it's bad for business. Companies that fail to value experience and institutional knowledge are companies that fail to reach their full potential. Several employees nodded in agreement. I could see Susan and David, the colleagues who had shared their concerns about Ryan's behavior, exchanging meaningful glances. Over the next several weeks, we'll be conducting a comprehensive review of all personnel policies and procedures. We'll also be evaluating employee performance with particular attention to professionalism, respect for colleagues, and adherence to company values. I paused, letting the implications of that statement sink in. Before we adjourn, I want to address something that happened at our corporate dinner 3 weeks ago. Some of you were present when an employee chose to publicly humiliate someone he perceived as vulnerable. The room went completely silent. Ryan looked like he might be sick. That behavior was unacceptable then, and it would be unacceptable now. Going forward, any employee who demonstrates that level of cruelty and unprofessionalism will face immediate disciplinary action, up to and including termination. I could hear people shifting in their seats, whispers being exchanged. Everyone who had been at the dinner knew exactly what I was referring to. That concludes today's meeting. Department heads, please stay behind for additional discussion. Everyone else, enjoy your weekend. As employees filed out, Ryan remained frozen in his chair. I could see him struggling to process what had just happened, trying to figure out how the pathetic old man he had tormented had suddenly become his boss. When the room had mostly cleared, Ryan finally stood up on shaky legs and approached me. His usual arrogance was completely gone, replaced by barely controlled panic. "Mr. Morrison," he stammered, "I had no idea. I mean, I didn't know you were—" "You didn't know I was what, Ryan?" I asked calmly. "You didn't know I was a human being deserving of basic respect. You didn't know I was someone with feelings who could be hurt by your cruelty. It was just a joke," he said weakly. "I didn't mean anything by it." "A joke," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "You think drugging someone's food and then publicly mocking them when they become ill is a joke?" Ryan's eyes went wide. I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," I said quietly. "You know exactly what you did. The question is whether you're going to continue lying about it or finally show some accountability for your actions." For a moment, Ryan looked like he might try to maintain his denial. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. "How did you know?" "Because I'm not the senile old fool you think I am," I replied. "I knew something was wrong when I became violently ill exactly 45 minutes after eating the food you brought me. I knew it wasn't a coincidence that you happened to be watching when it happened. And I knew it wasn't an accident that you had your phone ready to record my humiliation." Ryan's face crumpled. "Please, Mr. Morrison, I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake. But I need this job. Avery and I have bills, we have a mortgage. You should have thought about that before you decided to torment your father-in-law," I said, my voice still calm but with an edge of steel. "You should have considered the consequences before you chose cruelty over kindness." "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who had spent years trying to convince everyone that I was weak, confused, and irrelevant. He was trembling now, his carefully constructed facade of superiority completely shattered. "I'm going to do what should have been done months ago," I said finally. "I'm going to hold you accountable for your actions and your attitude." I walked over to my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "This contains documentation of your performance issues over the past 18 months. Missed deadlines, excessive personal phone calls, inappropriate comments about colleagues, insubordination toward supervisors." Ryan stared at the folder like it was a poisonous snake. "Your direct supervisor, Janet Crawford, has recommended your termination on 3 separate occasions. The only reason you still have a job is that previous management was reluctant to deal with the paperwork and potential legal complications." "Mr. Morrison, please," Ryan begged. "Give me another chance. I'll change. I'll be a better employee, a better person." "You're right," I said, closing the folder. "You will change, but you won't be doing it here." I handed him a sealed envelope. "Your employment with Hartwell Industries is terminated, effective immediately. This contains information about your final paycheck, benefits continuation, and the non-disclosure agreement you'll need to sign." Ryan took the envelope with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold it. "You can't do this. I'll fight it. I'll sue." "On what grounds?" I asked calmly. "Wrongful termination. You've been documented as a problem employee for over a year. Age discrimination. You're the one who's been making discriminatory comments, not me. Retaliation. Your termination is based on job performance, not personal grievances." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He knew I was right. He had no legal leg to stand on. "What about Avery?" he asked desperately. "She's your daughter. This will destroy our marriage." For the first time since the meeting began, I felt a flicker of sadness. Avery would be hurt by this, and that pain would extend to me as well. But I had learned something important over the past few weeks. Sometimes protecting the people you love means making difficult decisions, even when those decisions cause temporary pain. "Avery will have to make her own choices," I said. "But for the first time in years, those choices won't be influenced by someone who's been systematically poisoning her relationship with her father." Ryan stared at me, perhaps finally understanding the full scope of what he had lost. He had gambled everything on his assumption that I was powerless, that age meant weakness, that experience was worthless compared to his youthful arrogance. He had been wrong about everything. "I want you off the premises within 30 minutes, I said, returning to my professional tone. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings. As Ryan stumbled toward the door, he turned back one final time. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time since I had known him, he sounded genuinely sincere. "I know you are," I replied, "but some things can't be fixed with an apology." After he left, I stood alone in the conference room, feeling the weight of what I had just done. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was justice. It was accountability. It was the natural consequence of years of cruelty finally catching up with someone who thought he was immune to consequences. But most importantly, it was the beginning of my new life. A life where I would never again allow anyone to treat me as if I were worthless simply because of my age. The phone call came that evening just as I was sitting down to dinner. I had been expecting it, of course. Word travels fast in a marriage, especially when one spouse has just lost their job under dramatic circumstances. "Dad?" Avery's voice was strained, confused, and angry all at once. "Ryan told me what happened today. He said you fired him. Please tell me there's been some kind of mistake." I set down my fork and took a deep breath. This conversation would determine whether I had gained a company and lost a daughter, or whether the truth would finally set us both free. "There's been no mistake, Avery. I terminated Ryan's employment because his performance and behavior were unacceptable." "His behavior?" Her voice rose. "Dad, he's my husband. And you're treating him like some kind of criminal. What's gotten into you?" I had prepared for this moment, but it was still one of the hardest things I had ever had to do. "Sweetheart, I need you to come over. There are things about Ryan that you don't know, things that you need to understand before you make any decisions about your marriage or your relationship with me." "I can't believe this," she said, her voice breaking. "My own father destroyed my husband's career out of some petty grudge. Ryan told me about what happened at the corporate dinner, Dad. He said you had an accident and he was just trying to lighten the mood." "Is that what he told you?" I asked quietly. "That it was an accident?" "Of course it was an accident. What else would it be?" The pain in her voice was genuine, and I realized that Ryan had been lying to her just as systematically as he had been manipulating our relationship for years. "Avery, please come over. If after we talk you still think I'm wrong, I'll accept that. But you deserve to know the truth about what really happened." An hour later, she was sitting in my living room, her arms crossed defensively, her face set in an expression of protective anger. She had inherited my stubborn streak, and I knew that changing her mind wouldn't be easy. "All right, Dad," she said curtly. "Talk." I started with the corporate dinner, explaining how Ryan had brought me food and how the timing of my illness was too convenient to be coincidental. Then I showed her the documentation I had gathered about Ryan's work performance, his attitude toward older colleagues, and his pattern of unprofessional behavior. "This is all circumstantial," she said, though I could see doubt beginning to creep into her expression. "You can't prove he did anything to your food." "You're right," I admitted. "I can't prove that specific incident, but I can show you a pattern of behavior that demonstrates who your husband really is." I pulled out my laptop and opened a folder of audio files. I recorded several conversations over the past 2 weeks, conversations where Ryan expressed his true feelings about older workers, about me specifically, and about his plans for our family's future. Avery looked skeptical, but she didn't object when I played the first recording. It was Ryan talking to his colleagues in the break room, making jokes about dinosaurs in the workplace and specifically mentioning how he was working to convince Avery that her father needed to be managed more closely. As the recordings played, I watched my daughter's face change. The defensive anger gradually gave way to confusion, then hurt, then a dawning realization of how thoroughly she had been manipulated. The most damaging recording was from Ryan's phone conversation with someone I later learned was his brother. In it, Ryan laughed about how easy it was to control Avery's relationship with her father, how he had convinced her that I was becoming a burden, and how he planned to eventually convince her to have me declared incompetent so they could gain control of my assets. When that recording finished, Avery sat in stunned silence for several minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He was planning to have you declared incompetent." "Yes," I said gently. "He's been working towards that goal for months, maybe years. Every comment about my memory, every suggestion that I shouldn't be living alone, every time he made you worry about my mental state. It was all part of a long-term plan to gain control. Avery buried her face in her hands. I can't believe this. How could I have been so blind? Because you loved him, I said, moving to sit beside her on the couch. And because you're a good person who assumes other people are good too. Ryan is very skilled at manipulation, sweetheart. You're not the first person he's fooled, and you probably won't be the last. But I chose him over you, she said, tears streaming down her face. All those times when you tried to tell me something was wrong, all those times when I sided with him instead of listening to you. How can you ever forgive me? I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling like I was comforting the little girl who used to come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. There's nothing to forgive, I said softly. You were trying to be a good wife, trying to make your marriage work. Those are admirable qualities, even when they are directed at someone who doesn't deserve them. We talked until nearly midnight. Avery asked questions about the recordings, about Ryan's behavior at work, about the incidents over the years that had made me suspicious. Slowly, painfully, she began to see the full scope of how she had been manipulated. I need to go home and confront him, she said finally. I need to hear what he has to say about all this. Be careful, I warned her. When people like Ryan are cornered, they can become desperate. Don't let him turn this around on you or convince you that you're overreacting. She hugged me tightly before leaving, the first genuine physical affection I had received from my daughter in months. I'm so sorry, Dad, she whispered. I'm sorry I didn't see what he was doing to us. You see it now, I replied. That's what matters. The next few weeks were difficult for Avery, but liberating for both of us. Ryan initially tried to deny everything, then attempted to minimize his actions, and finally resorted to threats and emotional blackmail. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and Avery had finally seen him for who he really was. The divorce proceedings were swift and uncomplicated. Ryan had no financial assets to speak of, and Avery wanted nothing from him except her freedom. He found another job eventually, in a different city, and gradually faded from our lives like the bad dream he had always been. Meanwhile, I threw myself into running Hartwell Industries with an energy and enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. The company began to thrive under new leadership that valued experience alongside innovation, that treated all employees with respect regardless of their age, and that focused on sustainable growth rather than short-term profits. 6 months after Ryan's termination, Avery surprised me by asking if she could join the company. Her marketing background and fresh perspective, combined with her newfound appreciation for wisdom and experience, made her an invaluable addition to our team. I want to work somewhere that values people for who they are, not just how old they are, she explained during her interview. And I want to work with you, Dad. I've missed that. Working together gave us the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and shared goals. Avery proved to be an excellent employee, bringing innovative ideas that complemented rather than replaced our established practices. More importantly, she became my daughter. Again, not just in name, but in spirit. 1 year after the corporate dinner that had changed everything, we held Hartwell Industries' annual employee celebration. This time it was truly a celebration of our success, of our team, and of the culture of respect and inclusion we had built together. As I stood at the podium looking out at our employees and their families, I thought about how much had changed. I was no longer the lonely widower being systematically isolated by a manipulative son-in-law. I was a successful business owner, a respected leader, and most importantly, a father who had reclaimed his relationship with his daughter. This past year has taught me something valuable, I told the assembled group. It's taught me that age isn't something to be ashamed of or apologetic about. Experience isn't a liability to be overcome. It's an asset to be valued. And wisdom isn't the enemy of innovation. It's the foundation that makes real progress possible. The applause was warm and genuine. These people understood what I was talking about because they lived it every day, in an environment where everyone's contributions were valued. After the dinner, Avery and I stood outside the hotel, breathing in the cool evening air. "Are you happy, Dad?" she asked, linking her arm through mine. Really happy. I thought about the question seriously. Was I happy? I had lost years of my life to manipulation and isolation. I had endured humiliation and cruelty that no one should have to experience. But I had also discovered reserves of strength and determination I didn't know I possessed. I had built something meaningful from the ashes of my pain. Yes, I said finally. I'm happy, not because of what happened to me, but because of what I chose to do about it. I'm proud of you, she said quietly, for everything. For buying the company, for standing up to Ryan, for giving me the chance to see the truth. As we walked to our cars, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Ryan had tried to break me, to convince everyone, including myself, that I was worthless because of my age. Instead, he had inadvertently pushed me to discover just how much strength I still possessed. The humiliation at that corporate dinner had been the catalyst for the most transformative year of my life. I had reclaimed my dignity, rebuilt my relationship with my daughter, and found new purpose in leading a company that embodied the values I believed in. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to fight back, never too late to prove your worth, and never too late to find happiness on your own terms. As I drove home to the house that was finally peaceful again, I smiled at the thought of Ryan wherever he was now, hopefully having learned that age and experience are not things to be mocked, but respected. And if he hadn't learned that lesson yet, well, life has a way of teaching us all eventually. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when the victory brings not just justice, but peace,